The first time Lillian Kendrick noticed the man standing at the far edge of his property, she nearly dropped the bucket of well water she had hauled all the way from the creek. Because, in the fading amber light of that October dusk in 1882, with the Kansas plains stretching out around her like a great golden sea, she could have sworn for one breathless, awful moment that it was Thomas standing there. Watching her the way Thomas used to watch her from a distance before he ever said a word to her back in Missouri. But it was not Thomas. Thomas was dead. Thomas had been dead for 11 months, 3 weeks and 4 days, buried under the old cottonwood at the north end of the property that now bore only her name on the deed, a fact the county clerk in Harlow Creek had confirmed with no particular ceremony, and a stamp of ink that seemed entirely too casual a way to mark the end of everything she had ever planned for her life. So it was not Thomas standing at the edge of the neighboring parcel. It was someone else, a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled at the back of his neck beneath the brim of a sun-worn hat, and he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt in a way that was entirely unhurried, as though the whole wide Kansas sky were his personal concern, and he had time enough to consider every inch of it. Lillian set the bucket down and straightened her back, which ached in the way it always ached these days because there was no one to help her carry things anymore, and she looked at the man for a long moment. He did not wave. She did not wave. The line of fence posts between their two properties, most of them leaning at angles that suggested the previous owner had not been a particularly ambitious man, stood between them like a low and very impractical wall, and neither of them crossed it or made any move to suggest they intended to. After a time, Lillian picked up her bucket and walked back to the house. She thought about it that night while she sat at the kitchen table with a tallow candle burning down to nothing, and a plate of cornbread and cold beans that tasted exactly as lonely as everything else in her life tasted these days. The Calloway farm had stood empty since old Amos Calloway had gone to live with his daughter in Wichita the previous spring, which had been a quiet and unremarkable departure that the whole of Harlow Creek had noted with the same mild interest people give to a cloud passing overhead. She had not heard that anyone had purchased the property. She supposed that was her own fault for not paying closer attention to the affairs of the town. But since Thomas died, she had found the town rather difficult to endure. All those well-meaning faces with their well-meaning expressions and their well-meaning suggestions about what she ought to do next with herself. The man was back the following evening. Lillian was coming in from the garden, which she had been trying with considerable and exhausting determination to keep productive despite the fact that she was one person, and the garden had been sized for a family, and she caught sight of him through the gap in the fence line, standing in what would have been the Calloway yard, looking out across the flat horizon with the same unhurried ease as before. The sun was going down in long streaks of orange and pink behind him, and the light caught the dust on his coat and made him look briefly like something out of a painting in a book she had once seen in a shop in Kansas City, a long time ago, when she was someone who went to Kansas City. This time she stopped. She stood on her side of the fence line and she looked at him, and he seemed to sense it because he turned his head slowly, not startled, just gradual, like a man who was accustomed to being aware of things without making a performance of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He gave a very slight nod, the kind that acknowledged her presence without demanding anything in return, and she gave a very slight nod back, and that was all. She did not know his name yet. She would not ask it tonight. It went on that way for quite a long time, longer than Lillian would have been able to explain to anyone who might have asked her why she simply did not speak to the man, or why she simply did not avoid that particular corner of the property at dusk. But the truth was that she had stopped trying to explain herself to people several months ago, because she had found that the explanations always turned into conversations, and the conversations always turned into advice she had not asked for, and she was deeply tired of other people's advice. So she kept going to the fence line at dusk, and she kept seeing him there, and they kept doing that quiet, wordless thing that she could not quite name but that had begun to feel, against all reason, like the best part of her day. The neighboring farm, as she learned from Mabel Pratt at the general store in the third week of November, had been purchased in September by a man named George Brenner who had come down from Colorado, or possibly from Nebraska. Mabel was not sure which, but he had paid for the property outright, which was the kind of thing people noticed, and he was apparently attempting to run cattle on the pasture land, which everyone agreed was a reasonable ambition given the quality of the grass on the Callaway acreage. He was reported to be somewhere in his early 30s, unmarried, and not much for conversation, which Mabel offered as something mildly suspicious, but which Lillian privately found rather comforting. She did not mention to Mabel that she had been standing at the fence line looking at this man every evening for 3 weeks. George Brenner, for his part, was a man who had come to Kansas with the specific and unromantic intention of building something quiet. He had been in Colorado for 4 years, working cattle drives up through the mountains, and then spending the winters in a town that was too loud and too cold and too full of men who wanted to drink away the memory of hard seasons. He had saved his wages with the disciplined economy of someone who had learned early that money was the only thing that did not leave without warning, and when he had enough he had come south and east looking for something flat and manageable, and far enough from cities to feel honest. The Callaway farm had suited him perfectly. The land was good, the house needed work but was structurally sound, and the previous owner's departure had left behind a kitchen garden that showed signs of having been well tended at some point, though the weeds had taken advantage of the months of neglect. He had noticed the woman at the fence line on his third evening there. She had come out of the smaller farmhouse to the east carrying a basket of mending, and stood at the leaning fence posts with her face turned toward the horizon, and she had not looked at him right away, which he appreciated. He had spent enough time in enough places where people rushed to make you known to them before you had any sense of where you were, and he found it disagreeable. He stood on his side of the fence and watched the same sunset she was watching and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, that this was a place where he might actually stay. He learned her name from Bill Hennessy at the livery stable, who volunteered it along with the information that she was a widow, that her husband had died of a fever the previous winter, and that she was, in Bill's estimation, managing the farm with remarkable stubbornness for a woman on her own. George had thanked Bill for the information in a way that ended the conversation, because Bill had been gearing up to add his own opinions about what a woman on her own ought to do with a farm, and George had heard enough opinions of that type in his lifetime to know they were not worth listening to. Lillian Kendrick. He turned the name over in his mind that evening as he stood at the fence line and watched her come across the yard with a lantern already lit against the early dark of November, because the days were shortening fast now, and the cold was beginning to come in off the plains with real intention. She wore a dark coat that was practical rather than pretty, and her brown hair was pinned up under a hat that had seen better seasons, and she moved with the particular careful deliberateness of someone who had too much to do and not enough daylight to do it in. She stopped at the fence line. He was already there. They stood for a moment in the way they had been standing for weeks, and then she said without any particular preamble, "It gets dark faster now." Her voice was lower than he had expected, and steadier than the situation seemed to warrant, and he found he liked it immediately. "It does," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved across the grass between them with a long and quiet sound. "You are the man who bought the Callaway farm," she said. "Yes." "I am Lillian Kendrick," she said. "I live on the other side of the fence." "I know," he said, and something in the honest plainness of it made the corner of her mouth do something that was almost a smile. "I am George Brenner." "I know," she said with the same plain honesty, and this time something in the corner of his mouth did something similar. That was the entirety of that conversation. It was enough. She went back inside and he went back to the work he had been doing in the barn, patching a section of roof that leaked, and he found that the work went better than it had been going for the past hour, and he was not entirely sure why, but he did not examine it too closely. November wore on. The plains turned the color of dried straw, and the sky went that flat pewter gray that meant winter was not a distant thing anymore but an arriving one. And the mornings came in hard and cold with frost on the window glass, and the smell of distant snow in the air. Lillian was chopping wood one afternoon, a task she had been managing adequately though not efficiently since she was not built for it, the way Thomas had been, when the axe glanced off a knot in the log, and the handle cracked halfway up, leaving her standing in the yard with half a broken tool and a woodpile that was nowhere near adequate for what Kansas would throw at her in the coming months. She stood there for a moment and felt the full and specific weight of everything that was difficult about her life, all of it collected in that broken axe handle and the cold air and the inadequate woodpile. And she did the thing she had been doing since Thomas died, which was to press her lips together and refuse to cry, because if she started she was not sure she would stop, and there was too much to do for that. "That looks broken," said a voice. She turned. George Brenner was standing at the fence line, having apparently come over from his side of the property to check on a loose post, or possibly for some other reason she did not inquire about. "It is broken," she confirmed. He considered this. "I have a spare handle in the barn," he said, "if you need it." She looked at him for a moment. She had been taught, in the particular way that women of her generation and circumstance were taught, to be careful about accepting things from people, because things accepted created obligations, and obligations created complications, and complications had a way of becoming problems. But she also had a woodpile that would not see her through December, and cold that was coming regardless of her principles about self-sufficiency. "I would be grateful," she said, which was the most complicated thing she had said to him yet. He came back with the handle, and he fitted it for her without being asked, because he could see that the socket needed cleaning before the handle would seat properly. And he did it efficiently and without commentary on the state of her equipment, or the adequacy of her woodpile, or any of the other things that people had been commenting on with varying degrees of delicacy since Thomas died. He handed it back when it was done, and she thanked him, and he nodded, and went back to his own side of the fence, and Lillian stood there for a moment feeling something she had not felt in 11 months, which was the very cautious beginning of a sense that the world was not entirely made of things she had to manage alone. She went back to chopping wood. She was smiling slightly, though she would not have described it that way if anyone had asked her. The first real snow came in the second week of December, overnight and without particular warning, the way Kansas weather habitually behaved, and Lillian woke to find 18 inches of it sitting on everything she owned, and the temperature dropped to something that made her breath come out in clouds as she dressed in the cold of the bedroom that was still, after nearly a year, sized wrong for one person. She had to get to the animals. She had 2 horses, 4 chickens, and a milk cow named Ada, who was not a pleasant creature but was necessary. And they were all in the barn and all needed tending, and the snow between the house and the barn was deep enough to be genuinely difficult. She was halfway across the yard, breaking through drifts up to her knee in places, when she heard the sound of someone else breaking through drifts, and she turned to see George Brenner coming around the fence line with a shovel over one shoulder, and his breath making clouds around him and snow on the brim of his hat. "I dug out my own animals first," he said, by way of explanation for why he had not arrived sooner, which was a very specific and entirely reasonable thing to say, and which told her something important about him, that he understood priorities without needing to be instructed in them. "You do not need to help," she said. "I know that," he said, and kept walking toward her barn. She stood in the snow for a moment watching him go, and then she followed him because the animals needed feeding regardless of whether she had sorted out how she felt about receiving help. And by the time they had finished with Ada and the horses and the chickens and cleared a path from the house to the barn and from the barn to the well, The morning was half gone and the cold had moved from theoretical to extremely real, and she said, "Come in for coffee," because it would have been unkind to say anything else. He came in for coffee. He sat at her kitchen table in the chair that had been Thomas's chair, and she put coffee on and stood at the stove warming her hands. And the kitchen was very quiet for a while, except for the fire and the sound of the wind outside pressing against the house with considerable enthusiasm. She was acutely aware of another person in the room, the size of him, the way he held the coffee cup when she set it down, careful and not careless, the way he looked at the room without looking at her things the way some people did, as if taking inventory of the traces of the life she had lived here before. "You have been here 3 years," he said, which was a statement, not a question, so she understood he had heard things about her too. "Yes, we came from Missouri. Thomas and I," she said Thomas's name deliberately, the way she said it to herself sometimes, to keep the grief honest and present rather than something to be avoided. "He wanted land of his own. He got it." George was quiet for a moment. "I heard he died last winter." "He did. I am sorry." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, because he said it simply and then stopped, did not add anything to it, did not try to improve on it or qualify it or turn it into a conversation about what she should do now, and simple unadorned condolence was rarer than it ought to have been. She sat down across from him. "Where did you come from before the Callaway farm?" "Colorado, before that Nebraska, before that Iowa." He looked at his coffee cup. "I move a fair amount. You are stopping now." He thought about it with the same unhurried quality she had noticed in everything about him, not slow exactly, but unrushed, as though he considered the difference between speaking and speaking correctly to be worth the time it took. "I think so," he said. "The land here is good. I have enough cattle to start something reasonable. I would like to stop moving." She looked at him. He was not handsome in the way Thomas had been handsome, Thomas who had been all laughing warmth and easy charm. But there was something in his face that she found very steady, the kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with rigidity, but rather with the quality of a thing that has been tested and has held. Dark eyes that looked at you directly and did not perform anything, a mouth that seemed more accustomed to silence than to speech, but not in an unhappy way. "It is a good place to stay," she said, and meant more than the land, though she did not examine what she meant too closely. He finished his coffee and thanked her and put on his coat and hat and went back out into the snow, and Lillian sat at the table for a long time after he left and thought about the fact that the chair he had sat in felt different now than it had felt before, and she was not sure whether that was a good thing or not, but it did not feel like a bad thing, and on balance she decided that was enough for one December morning. Christmas came and went. Lillian spent it quietly with a candle in the window and a letter from her sister in Missouri that arrived 4 days after the holiday itself, which was the postal service performing up to its usual standard. She cooked herself a small meal that was better than it needed to be because she believed in not entirely surrendering to circumstances, and she read for most of the afternoon from a Bible that had been her mother's, and a novel she had borrowed from Mrs. Hennessy. At the library table the church ladies kept stocked, and it was not the worst Christmas she had ever had, though it was the loneliest. On Christmas morning she had found, at the fence line, a bundle wrapped in brown paper with no name on it, just set there on a fence post, as though it had simply arrived by natural processes. Inside was a thick wool scarf, dark blue, clearly purchased rather than made, which was not what she had expected. She stood in the cold holding it and looked toward George Brenner's house, where smoke was coming from the chimney, and she thought about going over there to say something. She did not. She put the scarf around her neck and it was warm, and she went back inside and carried it with her all day. She left him a jar of the apple preserves she had put up in September, set on the fence post the following morning. By afternoon it was gone. January was brutal, the way Kansas January tends to be, with a persistence that felt almost personal. The cold settled in and refused to move, and the wind off the plains, was the kind that found every gap in your clothing and every crack in your walls and took full advantage of both. Lillian kept the fire going with a commitment that bordered on religious devotion, and she managed her animals and her land and her solitude with the same careful daily determination she had been managing everything with for a year now. But there were days, particularly toward the end of January when the cold was at its worst, and the sky was that particular flat white that offered no promise of anything improving, that the determination was harder to maintain. It was on one of those days, a Thursday toward the end of January, that she was coming back from the barn in the early dark of late afternoon and saw George at the fence line, and something about the way he was standing was different from the usual watchful ease. There was something taut in his posture that she had not seen before, and she stopped. "Are you all right?" she asked, which was the first time she had asked him anything about himself rather than about practical matters. He looked at her. The cold was making his breath come fast, and there was something behind his eyes that she recognized because she had felt it herself, that look of a person who has been managing alone for a long time and has arrived at the place where the managing itself is the thing that has become almost too heavy. "I had a letter," he said. "My brother, he has had a bad season, lost most of his stock." "In Nebraska," he nodded. "He has a wife and 2 children." Lillian understood at once what the letter meant because she had done similar arithmetic herself in the lean months after Thomas died. "You were thinking of sending him money." "Yes, but it leaves you short." He looked at her steadily. "It might make this first season difficult." She thought about this. She thought about the jar of preserves on the fence post and the wool scarf and the axe handle and the morning in the snow, and she thought about all the ways in which people came to need each other out here on the plains where the land was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and there was no surviving it alone, not truly, no matter how much determination you brought to the attempt. "I have a proposal," she said. She had thought about it before, more than once, in a practical way that she had been careful not to confuse with any other kind of way. "My garden is more than I can manage alone. It was sized for 2 people. If you were to help me with the planting and the heavy work in spring, I could supply you with produce through the summer and fall. It would save you considerable money on provisions." He looked at her for a long moment. "And in return you help with the garden," she said, "and perhaps with other things that need doing. The roof on my barn has a section that worries me." "That is a more than fair trade in your favor," he said. "I know," she said, and smiled at him properly for the first time, and watched something shift in his face in response to it, some small and careful relaxing of the thing he kept very guarded there. "You helped me with my animals in December. Consider it a balance kept." He looked at the flat white sky and then back at her. "All right," he said. "Thank you, Lillian." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it somewhere below her breastbone. "You are welcome, George," she said, and went back inside and stood at the kitchen window for a while looking out at nothing in particular. He sent the money to his brother that week. She knew because he told her at the fence line the following evening, which was itself something, the telling, the small act of sharing a decision with someone else. She filed it away carefully, the way she had been filing away all the small things about him. The coffee cup held careful and not careless, the simple condolence, the scarf on the fence post, the deliberate and unhurried way he had of turning her name into something that sounded as though it mattered. February was shorter if not warmer, and March came in with the particular violence of a season that has been pent up too long, wind and rain and mud that grabbed at your boots with a kind of personal antagonism. Lillian began to turn over the kitchen garden in the last week of March, when the ground was workable but the air was still cold enough to make the work unpleasant, and George appeared over the fence line one morning without announcement or fanfare, and picked up the other spade. She had leaned against the fence post the night before, as though he had known it would be there, or as though she had known he would come. And they worked together through the morning in a companionable silence that was entirely different from the early silence at the fence line, because it was a working silence, two people engaged in a shared purpose, and it had a warmth to it that the actual air temperature did not account for. By noon they had turned over half the garden and Lillian's back was making its usual complaints, and she straightened and looked at what they had accomplished and felt a satisfaction she had not felt in the garden since Thomas died, when the work had become purely mechanical and joyless. "You are good at this," she said. George was tamping down a turned row with the back of his spade. "I grew up on a farm in Iowa," he said, "before everything else." What was the everything else? He considered. "After my father died, I went west. There was nothing to stay for in Iowa. I was 19. He looked across the garden. I worked cattle drives, spent time in mining camps. Tried homesteading in Nebraska, which did not take. Ended up in Colorado for 4 years working for a ranching outfit. And now here," she said. "And now here," he agreed, and looked at her in a way that she looked away from, not because it was unwelcome but because she was not ready yet for what it might mean if she looked back at it directly. They ate lunch at her kitchen table again, which was becoming a habit, and she made biscuits because she had extra flour, and because she found she wanted to, which was something she noted about herself with careful interest. The making of food for someone else, the pleasure of it, was something she had thought was gone with Thomas, something specific to that particular domesticity, and finding it present again in a different form was both a surprise and a complicated one. "You read a great deal," he said, looking at the stack of books on the shelf near the window. "Yes. Thomas used to say it was my worst habit." She said it easily, naturally, the way she had been beginning to be able to talk about Thomas, not with the brittle, careful quality of early grief, but with something that was simply true and therefore all right to say. "He did not read much himself, but he never minded me reading." "What do you read?" She told him, and was surprised to find that he had read some of the same things, that in the long winters in Colorado with limited entertainment, he had worked through whatever books came his way, and they talked about books for a while in a way that she had not done since leaving Missouri, because Thomas had been wonderful but not a reader, and the women in Harlow Creek had mostly different interests. And the pleasure of having someone to talk to about a book she had thought about was so unexpectedly acute that she had to look out the window for a moment to collect herself. He noticed. She could tell he noticed because he shifted the conversation gently sideways to something easier, asking about the variety of apple tree she had in the yard and what it produced, and she was grateful for the tact of it. April came and the world changed entirely, the way the Kansas plains changed in spring, all that pent-up green breaking through the dead straw of winter with a suddenness that still surprised her after 3 years, as if the land could not believe its own renewal either. The garden went in properly in the second week of April, the two of them working together through mornings that became afternoons, and then evenings that left them sitting on Lillian's porch steps sharing water from the same bucket, because it was too much trouble to go inside, with dirt on their hands and on their faces, and a sense of accomplishment that had no need of ceremony. The dusk ritual at the fence line continued, even on the days they had worked together, which had struck Lillian initially as slightly strange, until she understood that it was something separate, that it had its own meaning that was not the same as the working together and the lunches and the conversations about books. The fence line at dusk was something they had established before they had any of the rest of it, before they had names for each other, and it had a quality of its own, a quiet and private thing, and she was not ready to see it dissolve into something more ordinary. She suspected, from the way he stood there each evening with that particular still quality that she had come to read fairly well, that he felt the same. In the second week of May, something happened that clarified a great deal for Lillian without either of them saying a single word about it. She was on her way back from town, driving the small wagon with provisions she had picked up at the general store, when the left front wheel hit a rut at the wrong angle on the dirt road, and the axle cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, and the wagon lurched and dropped, and she was thrown sideways off the seat, and onto the road with enough force to knock the breath completely out of her body. She lay there for a moment on the rutted dirt road looking up at a very large sky and taking stock of herself, which appeared to be bruised but otherwise intact. And then she heard hoofbeats and George Brenner materialized out of nowhere, which in fact meant he had been coming from town himself in the opposite direction and had seen the whole thing. And he was off his horse before it fully stopped and beside her on the road with his hands on her shoulders asking if she was hurt with a directness and urgency in his voice that she filed away next to all the other things she had been filing. "I am all right," she said. "I fell on my left side. I am winded." "Lie still," he said, not in an ordering way but in the way of someone who knows something about injuries and is genuinely alarmed. "I am all right, George." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely interpret, because it was several things at once, relief and concern and something that had nothing to do with either of those. And then he helped her to her feet with both his hands and did not let go immediately once she was standing, and she did not step back immediately. And for a moment they stood in the middle of the road, with the dust settling around them, and his hands on her arms and her hands on his forearms, and neither of them spoke. "The wagon wheel is broken," she said finally, because something had to be said and that was the safest available option. "I can see that," he said, and let go of her arms with a care that she noticed, a deliberateness that suggested it was not an absence of desire to hold on but rather a decision made in full awareness. He helped her get the wagon off the road and tied his horse to it and walked her home, leading the horse behind them with the ruined wagon rolling badly on 3 wheels and the broken axle scraping the ground. And they walked the 1.5 miles back to the farm in the fading afternoon light talking about the wagon, and about where to get the axle fixed, and about whether Bill Hennessy at the livery could do it, or whether she needed to go to the blacksmith in the neighboring town of Crest Falls. And none of that was what either of them was talking about. That evening she stood at the fence line and he was there on his side, and the sky was very clear and very full of stars beginning to appear at the edges of the darkening blue, and she said, without looking at him, "I am glad you happened to be on that road today." "So am I," he said, and his voice had that quality in it that she had been careful not to listen to too directly for several months now. And she turned and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and the long quiet between them was the same as always, but it was different too. Everything a degree or two warmer than it had been before the road, before his hands on her arms, before the deliberate letting go. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat on the worn wood and thought carefully about Thomas, about what she owed him, about what grief was supposed to last, about the line between honoring a love and allowing yourself to be held in place by the memory of it like a butterfly pinned to a board. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him truly, and he was gone. And she was 31 years old, and she was on this land alone. And there was a man on the other side of the fence who held coffee cups carefully and made simple condolences, and stood quietly in the dark every evening without demanding anything of her. And she was not sure what she was waiting for except possibly the right moment, or possibly the right amount of courage, or possibly simply the right number of evenings. She decided, sitting there with her hands flat on the table, that she would let herself stop being so careful. Not immediately, not all at once, but incrementally, the way you approach something large and uncertain, one small step at a time. June was warm and full of green things growing, and the garden was extraordinary, the best it had looked since the first summer she and Thomas had put it in, which she attributed partly to George's strong back and partly to the fact that she was giving it better attention these days, because the garden had become a thing she shared with someone rather than a thing she endured alone. They worked in it together 3 or 4 mornings a week, and on the mornings they did not she found herself thinking about the evenings, and on the evenings she stood at the fence line she found herself sometimes wanting to say more than she said. It was George who moved first, which surprised her a little, because he had seemed so content with the established pattern of their acquaintance. But on a warm evening in the middle of June, when the fireflies were just beginning to appear at the edges of the tall grass beyond the fence line, he said, "Lillian." "Yes," she said, "I would like to ask you something." "All right." He was quiet for a moment. The fireflies blinked in and out of existence in the grass, small private lights. "Would you come to the social next Saturday, with me, as a companion for the evening?" She looked at him. He was looking at the grass, not at her, which she found very endearing, this man who was generally so steady and direct, standing there with his hat in his hands looking at fireflies rather than at her while he asked her to the church social. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and there was a very long moment in which the world was entirely quiet, except for the fireflies and the grass and the sound of her own heartbeat, which had increased considerably. "Good," he said. "Thank you," she laughed. She had not laughed easily or involuntarily in a long time, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both of them, genuine and warm in the summer dark, and he smiled back at her with a full smile that she had never seen before and which was so entirely different from his usual contained expression that it made her feel as though she had been given access to a room in a house she had been standing outside of for months. "Good night, George," she said. "Good night, Lillian," he said, and there it was again, her name in his voice, and she went inside and stood in the kitchen and felt herself smiling in the dark. The church social was held in the yard behind the First Methodist Church on the third Saturday of June, under lanterns strung between the fence posts, and it was exactly the kind of event that Harlow Creek did very well. A long table of food contributed by a dozen different households. A fiddle player named Walt Caraway, who was 70 years old, and had been playing at every social event in the county for most of that time. And a collection of townspeople who ranged from genuinely pleasant to relentlessly curious, and who were, to a person, extremely interested in the sight of Lillian Kendrick arriving with George Brenner. Lillian wore her blue dress, the good one that she had worn to Thomas's funeral, and then put away for nearly a year, and then taken out again that morning and pressed carefully, telling herself it was simply the best dress she owned, and not thinking too hard about anything else. Her hair was down and pinned differently than usual, and she had pinned the blue scarf, the one George had given her at Christmas, at the collar of the dress, and when George came to the door to collect her and she stepped out, he looked at the scarf, and then at her, and the look in his eyes was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. "You look fine," he said, which was possibly the most understated thing anyone had ever said to her, and she appreciated it more than she would have appreciated any number of more elaborate compliments. They walked to the social together through the warm summer evening, and the conversation was easy and unremarkable, about the garden and about the road, and about whether old Walt Caraway would play any dancing songs this year or stick to the hymns, which was apparently an annual controversy of some significance. When they arrived, Lillian was aware of eyes and of the slight pause in conversations that she recognized as the particular social notation of something that people had been wondering about becoming definite, and she held her chin at the angle she had cultivated through 11 months of being a widow alone, the angle that indicated she was perfectly comfortable with being looked at, and had no intention of apologizing for existing. George noticed the looking too. He was not entirely impervious to it, but he managed it with a composure that she admired, standing beside her and talking to Bill Hennessy about cattle prices with the same easy, unhurried quality he brought to everything. And every so often he turned his attention back to her with a smile that was not for the room, only for her, and she felt each one of those smiles with a specificity that she did not try to suppress. They danced twice, which in the context of a church social in Harlow Creek, Kansas in 1883 was a meaningful number. Walt Caraway did condescend to play dancing songs eventually, 2 reels and a waltz, and during the waltz George's hand was on her waist with the same careful and deliberate quality she had come to associate with everything about him, not tentative but considered, as though touching her was something he took seriously. She was aware of his shoulder under her hand and the warmth of him, and the fact that she was not thinking about Thomas at all, not even in the part of her mind where she had been keeping careful account of such things, and that instead she was entirely present in the yellow lantern light with the fiddle playing and George Brenner's eyes on her. When the music stopped, he did not immediately move his hand from her waist. She did not immediately move hers from his shoulder. A second passed, and then another, and then someone nearby said something to someone else, and the moment passed naturally and they stepped apart. But the warmth of the contact remained in her hand and her side all the way through the rest of the evening. He walked her home in the dark under a sky that was outrageous with stars, the kind of sky that only presents itself at summer's height on the plains where there is nothing between you and the heavens. And they walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry, and the evening was warm and pleasant, and the road home was quiet except for their footsteps, and the sound of crickets celebrating in every ditch and field. At her gate he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they stood looking at each other in the starlight, and she thought he was going to say something, and then she thought he might kiss her, and then she thought she might kiss him, and then they stood there for another long moment in the particular suspended quality of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are each waiting for the other to take the first step. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said. "Thank you for asking me," she said. He took her hand. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly and with full intention, his fingers closing around hers in the dark, and she let him, and they stood there for a while at her gate with their hands joined and the stars overhead, and it was the simplest possible thing, and it was everything. "I think about you," he said. "I want you to know that I think about you quite a lot." She tightened her grip slightly on his hand. "I think about you too," she said, and felt the plainness of it, the honesty of it, the relief of having said it out loud after months of managing it quietly inside. He raised her hand briefly to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and very deliberate, and she felt it all the way to her spine. Then he let go and said good night and walked back down the road, and she stood at her gate watching him go until the dark swallowed him up, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen with both hands pressed to her face and smiled against her own palms like a woman who has been surprised by joy after a long cold winter, which was precisely what she was. July arrived with heat and purpose. The garden was producing well, and Lillian was busy with the preserving, which was serious work in the summer, canning and pickling and putting up everything that could be put up for the months ahead when the land would be white and silent and nothing grew. George helped with the heavy lifting, the carrying of the large water bath canner that was genuinely too heavy for one person to manage safely, the hauling of wood to keep the fire going at the right temperature, the carrying of crate after crate of glass jars up from the cellar and back down again when they were filled and sealed. They worked well together. They had learned each other's rhythms by now, the way two people who spend considerable time in the same space learn where the other one moves and how, so that they were rarely in each other's way and often, without discussion, doing complementary things at the same time. She found this, the wordless ease of it, the way she did not have to explain her intentions to him, to be one of the most intimate things she had ever experienced, and she thought about that sometimes when she was putting up beans or checking the seals on the tomato jars, thought about the different kinds of knowing a person. She had told him about Thomas more than once now, not the death particularly but the person, the laughing warmth of him, the way he had sung to himself while he worked, his great ambitions for the farm and what it would become, and George had listened to all of it with the same full attention he gave to everything she said, never hurrying her and never trying to compare himself favorably or unfavorably, simply listening, which was more generous than it might sound. She learned more about him, too, piece by piece, the way you learn things about a person who was not raised to volunteer information freely. He had come from a family of 5 children, the second oldest, which explained a great deal about both his sense of responsibility and his comfort with silence. His father had died when George was 16 of an injury sustained during the harvest, a thing that had ended his childhood and redirected his life. He had been in love once before, briefly, with a woman in Colorado who had ultimately gone back east to marry someone with better prospects, which he described without bitterness, but with the careful matter-of-factness of someone who has processed a disappointment thoroughly and set it down. "Were you very hurt by it?" Lillian asked one afternoon, not prying but genuinely wanting to know. He thought about it. "Yes, for a while, but I think we were not well suited. She wanted things I could not give her and things I did not want to give her, and both of those were true at the same time. She understood that perfectly. She understood the distinction between being unable and being unwilling and the importance of knowing the difference. What did she want? Town life. Society. A man who enjoyed the things that go with those." He glanced at her. "I am not that kind of man." "No," she agreed, "you are not." And she said it in a way that made clear she considered this a quality rather than a deficiency. He looked at her for a long moment over the jar she was sealing, with the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window and the smell of hot brine and vinegar in the air. And something in his expression was very direct and very warm, and she held his gaze because she had decided to stop being so careful about looking at the things she was feeling. Late in July, George's brother came. His name was Henry Brenner, and he arrived with very little notice, a letter getting there only 2 days before the man himself, which Lillian learned about when George mentioned it at the fence line with an expression that contained a complicated collection of emotions. Love for his brother and concern about the state of affairs that had driven him here, and something else, a slight wariness that she took to mean the visit carried some complexity. Henry was younger than George by 4 years and looked it, a thinner and more angular version of his brother, without the same quality of settledness, not in an unpleasant way, but in the way of someone who had not yet found the thing that would make him stop moving. He arrived on a dusty horse with his hat pushed back and an easy grin, and shook Lillian's hand when she was introduced at the fence line, with the particular frank appraisal of a man who is measuring someone against the image he has formed from a brother's uncharacteristically warm letters home. "Lillian Kendrick," Henry said, as if confirming something. "George has written about you." "Has he?" she said, and did not look at George, though she was very aware of him. "He mentioned you. In the vicinity of often," Henry said, and there was laughter in it. George said with absolute composure, "Henry has come to see about work. There may be something with the railroad in Crest Falls." "There might be," Henry agreed, cheerfully ignoring his brother's attempt to redirect the conversation. Henry stayed for a week, sleeping at George's house and spending considerable time at Lillian's kitchen table, which he seemed to have identified rapidly as the most comfortable place in the immediate vicinity. He was warm and funny in an extravagant way that was very different from George's quiet, and she liked him immediately while understanding entirely why the two of them, similar in some fundamental ways and different in almost all the surface ones, probably exhausted each other in the particular way that only brothers manage. On Henry's 3rd evening there, the 3 of them sat on Lillian's porch after supper in the cooling air of the July night, and Henry, who had been eating as though food were a recently discovered concept, and clearly felt that adequate provocation had been provided by Lillian's cooking, said, "George, are you going to say something to this woman, or are you going to stand at that fence every evening until you are both considerably older than you are now?" There was a silence. George looked at his brother with an expression of such complete and patient exasperation that Lillian had to press her lips together. "Henry," George said, "I am merely raising the question that I imagine you have been raising privately for some time," Henry said, entirely untroubled. Lillian looked at the darkened yard and said very quietly, "He is not wrong." Another silence, different from the first one. She was aware of George looking at her. "No," George said at length. "He is not." Henry stood up from his chair with the air of a man who has accomplished something significant. "I am going to walk down to the well," he said, and departed in the direction of the well with unconvincing casualness, and they heard him whistling to himself as he went. Lillian looked at George. George looked at Lillian. The porch was warm and dark, and the fireflies were going in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a nightbird was making its single repeated note. "Lillian," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it properly." "All right," she said, and turned to face him fully. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had stopped being impatient with, because she knew it was not hesitation but care. "I did not come here looking for anything of this kind," he said. "I came here to build something quiet on my own. But you were there every evening, and then you were there more than that. And I found that you were the part of every day that I looked forward to most. And I have not felt that before in any way that felt this much like the right thing." She let this settle in her for a moment. The nightbird went on with its single note. The fireflies blinked. "Thomas and I were happy," she said, because she owed him honesty about this. "I loved him and I was happy with him. And then he was gone, and I thought there would not be another chapter to my life, only the continuing of the one that ended with him." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I was wrong about that." She heard him exhale slowly, as though he had been holding that breath for longer than the conversation. "I am not a simple man to be with," he said. "I am quiet in ways that can seem like absence. I am not very good at the kind of talk that makes things feel easier in the short term. I am better at the long term." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you for nearly a year." He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she thought that perhaps she should wait for him to say something else, something formally romantic in the way she had read about in novels. But she had also been managing alone for over a year, and she had not become a woman who waited unnecessarily when the thing she wanted was right in front of her. She leaned forward and kissed him, briefly and with full intention, and he was very still for exactly 1 moment, and then he was not still at all. He turned toward her and kissed her back with a warmth and a care and a depth that had nothing of hesitation in it, only the quality of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this and is not going to treat it carelessly. When they separated, they were both quiet for a moment that had nothing uncomfortable in it. "I have been wanting to do that since approximately March," she said. He laughed, a genuine and surprised sound that she stored in the same place as the full smile from the social and the name in his voice and all the other small accumulations of the past year. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since considerably before March." Henry came back from the direction of the well with conspicuous loudness, whistling and scuffing his boots, and sat back down in his chair with an expression of elaborate innocence that fooled no one and was not attempting to. "Well," he said, "it is a fine evening." "Go to bed, Henry," George said, without any real edge to it. Henry went to bed with visible satisfaction. The weeks that followed were a particular quality of summer that Lillian would remember for the rest of her life, warm and easy, and full of the specific happiness of two people who have found each other after long seasons of being alone, and are discovering what it is to be known by someone new, which is different from the being known of long marriage and not lesser for it, only different, because it contains the particular pleasure of revelation, of showing someone a part of yourself and watching them receive it with gladness. They fell into new patterns alongside the old ones. The fence line at Dusk remained theirs in the way it had always been, unchanged in its form but different in its content, because now it was full of speech, full of the kinds of conversations that tend to happen at the end of a day when the light is going, and the work is behind you, and there is nothing to perform for anyone. Conversations about small things and large ones, about the cattle and the garden and the stories of each other's lives, and the things they thought about at night when the house was quiet. He kissed her at the fence line on a Tuesday evening in August, when the sky was the deep bruised purple of the end of a long hot day, and the grass was full of sound, and the moment arrived with a kind of natural necessity that had nothing theatrical about it. His hand on her face was warm and careful, and she put both her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady, and she was very glad about that. August moved into September, and September was when Lillian received an unexpected visit from a man named Calvin Pryor, who was a lawyer from Wichita, and who arrived at her door one afternoon with a letter and an expression she did not like. He informed her, with practiced sympathy that was only somewhat genuine, that there was a claim being made against a portion of her property line by a man named Douglas Merritt, who had purchased the Granger land to the south, and was claiming that the original survey placing the boundary between his land and hers was in error by some 40 yards in a direction that was decidedly favorable to Mr. Merritt. Lillian stood on her porch and looked at this man from Wichita with his city clothes and his practiced sympathy, and felt a cold and very clear anger that was entirely different from grief, anger being a much simpler emotion, and in some ways a relief. 40 yards did not sound like much, but it was the lower garden, the best watered section of her property, and she was not going to give it up. She said, "I will need to see the original survey." Calvin Pryor looked mildly surprised, as though he had expected less forthright resistance from a widow farmer. "Of course," he said. "And I will need time to consult with my own counsel," she added, which she said with more confidence than she felt, since she had no counsel and could not at the moment afford any. She told George that evening at the fence line and watched his expression shift through something very specific, the quality of a man who is not theatrical about anger but in whom anger is a very real and steady thing when it arrives. "Douglas Merritt," he said. "I know that name. He has been buying up land south of town. Bill Hennessy mentioned him. He is not well regarded. The survey was done in 1879, she said. Thomas paid for it himself when we filed the deed. It was a licensed surveyor from Hutchinson. Do you have the document?" "Yes, it is in the strong box." He looked at her steadily. "We will go to the county clerk together and examine the original records," he said. "Will tomorrow morning suit you?" "Yes," she said, and felt the particular and very specific feeling of not being alone in a problem, which was so much more than practical. They went to the county clerk the following morning and examined the records, and then they went to see a lawyer named James Flood, who had an office above the hardware store and who was generally considered competent. James Flood looked at the documents and at the original survey and said that, while the case was not without complication, the 1879 survey appeared on its face to be correctly filed, and that Merritt's claim would require him to demonstrate material error in the original survey, which was not, given the licensed surveyor involved, a simple thing to do. Merritt's claim was formally filed in early October. The county court was not a rapid institution, and the case would take some months to resolve, but James Flood was confident, and Lillian had the original documents, and George, who had become in the months since August something that she had stopped being careful about naming to herself, was beside her through all of it. Attending the court hearings and sitting in James Flood's office, and making it absolutely clear to anyone who might have been inclined to suggest that a widow farmer was an easy target that this particular widow farmer was not operating alone. Douglas Merritt, who appeared in person at the first court hearing, and turned out to be a broad-faced man with small eyes, and the particular confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted by application of money and persistence, looked at George standing beside Lillian with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his estimates. George looked back at him with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unyielding and said nothing, because he did not need to. The case was resolved in November, 3 weeks before the first anniversary of George's arrival at the Callaway farm. The court found the original survey valid and Merritt's claim without merit and ordered him to pay a portion of the court costs, which James Flood was visibly pleased about. Lillian stood on the courthouse steps in the cold November air and felt something released from her shoulders that she had been carrying since September. "It is done," she said. "It is," George agreed. She looked at him, standing there in his coat with the cold wind off the plains ruffling his hair, and she thought about how different this autumn felt from the previous one, how different every season was when lived in the company of someone who chose to stand beside you, and she felt the fullness of that so acutely that she had to look away at the street for a moment. "George," she said. "Yes." She turned back to him. "I would like you to ask me to marry you," she said, which was not exactly how those conversations traditionally proceeded, but she had decided at some point in the past year that traditional procedure had its limitations, and that there was something to be said for saying the true thing plainly. He looked at her for a long moment, and then a smile moved across his face, slow and full and entirely private, the one that was only for her. "I was going to," he said. "I have been working up to it for some time." "I know," she said. "You are thorough." He laughed, and then he was serious again, and he reached out and took her hand on the courthouse steps in Harlow Creek, Kansas, on a cold November day, and he said, "Lillian Kendrick, I would very much like you to be my wife. I cannot promise easy seasons or a life without difficulty, but I can promise that I will stand beside you in all of it, and that I will never give you a reason to doubt where I am. Will you have me?" "Yes," she said, without any hesitation at all. He pulled her toward him and kissed her on the courthouse steps in full view of anyone who happened to be on the street, which included Bill Hennessy and two of the church ladies, and a drifter who appeared mildly confused about what he was witnessing, and Lillian kissed him back with complete unconcern for any of them. They were married on the 15th of December, 1883, in the First Methodist Church in Harlow Creek, in a ceremony performed by Reverend Moore and attended by most of the town, because an event of this nature was not one Harlow Creek was going to miss. Lillian wore the blue dress again, with the scarf, and George wore his best coat, which had been pressed to within an inch of its life, and Henry Brenner was there, having returned from the railroad job in Crest Falls for the occasion, and he stood up as George's witness with an expression of profound satisfaction that he made no effort to conceal. Mabel Pratt cried, which surprised Lillian since Mabel did not generally display strong emotion, and Mrs. Hennessy supplied a wedding cake that was better than anything that occasion required, and for which Lillian was genuinely grateful. Bill Hennessy shook George's hand with a force that suggested a point was being made, and Reverend Moore said the words with the sonorous gravity that was his professional signature. And when it was over and George and Lillian stood facing each other in the front of the church with their hands joined, she looked at him and thought about the first evening at the fence line, the shadow of him in the dying light, and how she had nearly dropped a bucket of water, and how she had no idea. Standing in that field not quite a year and a half ago, what was standing quietly on the other side of the fence from her grief. That night, in the farmhouse that was now both of theirs, which they had decided to make their shared home since it was the better of the two houses, and because the Calloway house would serve well for storage and eventually perhaps for other purposes, they sat by the fire in the late quiet, and Lillian leaned against his shoulder and George's arm came around her with the same considered and deliberate warmth he brought to everything he did. "1 year ago," she said, "I stood in my yard and thought I saw Thomas for a moment, and then I realized it was a stranger. He was quiet, listening. I thought you were a strange kind of ghost," she said, "something the prairie sent to trouble me." He pressed his lips to her hair. "And now," she lifted her head and looked at him. "Now I think the prairie sent you to stay," she said, and his eyes were dark and warm and entirely on her, and he kissed her gently and she kissed him back with all the accumulated meaning of every dusk they had stood at the fence line and not said why, and outside the Kansas wind made its usual sweeping claims against the house, and the house, as it always had and would always continue to, held. Winter passed. They learned the specific and particular intimacies of sharing a house with someone, the small negotiations of space and habit and preference that are both the comedy and the foundation of a shared life, and they managed them with the same practical goodwill they had managed the garden and the snow and the court case, which was to say directly, and without sustained grievance. George's quietness in the early morning was something she accommodated easily and even valued, having always found early mornings better for her own private thoughts before the day required her full social engagement. Her habit of reading very late was something he accommodated with equal ease, falling asleep beside her lamplight without complaint. They kept the fence line. They still stood there sometimes in the evenings, though now the standing was together on one side or the other, and the fence itself had been substantially repaired, the leaning posts replaced, and the wire made taut, partly because a proper fence was practical and partly, she suspected on George's part, because the fence line had a meaning for both of them that neither of them needed to state. Spring came in its usual violent way, and with it the realization in April that Lillian was going to have a child. She stood in the kitchen on a morning in mid-April, with the light coming through the window in long, clean lines, and this knowledge in her body like a new weather, and she felt simultaneously terrified and luminous, which was itself a kind of answer to the question of whether she had been right to believe the world was not finished with her. She told George that evening at the fence line, which seemed right, because that was where things between them had a habit of being said truly. He stood very still for a moment, the way he got still when something moved him profoundly, and his first instinct was to hold it carefully before responding. Then he turned to her, and his face was doing all the things she knew his face could do when he allowed it, the warmth and the directness and the particular unguarded quality that was only for her, and he crossed the fence line, which was a thing they had been doing for over a year now but which felt in this moment like the symbolic act it always secretly was, and he took her face in both his hands. "Are you well?" he said, and he meant everything by it. "I am well," she said, and she meant everything by that too. He held her for a long time in the May evening with the last light going and the Kansas plains spreading out around them in every direction, and she pressed her face against his neck and felt his heart beat, steady and unhurried as it always was, and the sound of it was the sound of the thing she had not known she was waiting for all those evenings at the fence line. The summer was warm and productive, and Lillian was strong and capable, and not inclined to be otherwise simply because she was with child, though she found that George had developed a very attentive quality in the direction of things she was attempting to lift that she found both touching and occasionally maddening. She told him this in October when he appeared at her side while she was attempting to move a barrel of apples, and he looked at her and said, with absolute calm, "Then tell me what you need moved and I will move it instead." And she had to laugh because there was really no arguing with that. Henry wrote to say the railroad work had dried up and he was thinking of moving on, possibly to Texas, and George wrote back and told him to come to Kansas if he needed somewhere to land, and Lillian wrote a postscript to the letter telling Henry that the spare room was available and the cooking was good, and Henry arrived in November with his horse and his hat and the same easy grin, and settled into the Calloway house across the fence line with the apparent intention of determining what happened next from a comfortable vantage point. Henry was unexpectedly good at farming. This surprised him as much as anyone. He had spent years moving away from the Iowa childhood he and George had shared, but the land apparently remembered him in some way, and he took to helping George with the cattle and the planting with a willingness that his previous restlessness had not predicted. Lillian watched the two of them working together across the fence line in the December cold, and thought that the Calloway farm had become something different than it had been, not just a neighboring property but a part of a larger thing, and the thought pleased her. On the 3rd day of January, 1885, in the back bedroom of the farmhouse with the snow outside and the fire high, and the doctor from Harlow Creek in attendance and George pacing the kitchen floor, with a concentration that Henry would describe later as the most alarming thing he had witnessed since a mountain winter in Colorado, Lillian gave birth to a boy. He was strong and he was loud and he had dark hair, and when Lillian held him for the first time, she was so full of everything that she could not speak for several minutes. George came in when the doctor summoned him and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this child, this very small and very opinionated and very new person, and his face was so completely open that Lillian pressed her free hand to his cheek and felt him lean into it. "Thomas," she said. She had been thinking about it for months. "I would like to call him Thomas, after his father, after my first husband, who should be known by someone who comes after." George looked at her. She had worried briefly, in the way one worries about things in the middle of the night when everything seems more complicated than it does in daylight, that this might be difficult for him, the naming, the placing of that name in their new life. But she looked at his face and there was nothing difficult in it, only a steadiness and a warmth, and a full understanding of what she was saying and why. "Thomas Brenner," he said, and nodded, and the nod had the quality of something honored and intended. "I think that is a very good name." She let out a breath she had not known she was holding and shifted the baby so George could take him, which he did with care so extreme it was almost ceremonial. And Thomas Brenner looked up at him with the myopic and ancient expression of every newborn, and George looked back with an expression that contained the beginning of everything. Henry was told the name through the bedroom door and could be heard expressing approval in his usual enthusiastic terms, and the doctor said the mother and baby were both doing very well, and outside the Kansas January did what January always did, but in the farmhouse there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Spring came back. Thomas Brenner, who had his mother's brown eyes and his father's dark hair, and the particular determined personality that seemed to have come from some combination of both of them, and possibly also from the Kansas soil itself, was 4 months old and already conducting what appeared to be a campaign of resistance against any nap longer than 30 minutes. Lillian carried him in the garden while she worked, which he regarded with evident interest, and George would stop work to come and take him when he fussed, walking the yard with him in the late afternoon sun with the ease of a man who had taken to fatherhood with the same undemonstrative competence he brought to everything else. Henry had stayed. He had apparently reached some private decision about the staying during the long January of Thomas's birth, and he had written to his wife in Nebraska, who had left him 2 years previous, citing irreconcilable disagreements about the direction of their life. And whatever that letter contained, it seemed to have opened a door that had been closed for some time. Because by March he had a letter back that he would not share the contents of, but which produced the first genuinely settled expression Lillian had seen on his face. She did not ask. She trusted that whatever was happening would unfold in its own time, and Henry's private life was his own to manage. By summer she was proven right. Henry's wife, a small, fierce woman named Clara, who arrived in June with 2 bags and an expression that suggested she was prepared to be disappointed, but was cautiously willing to review the evidence, appeared at the door of the Calloway house one afternoon, and Henry stood in the doorway looking at her with such complete and naked relief that Lillian, watching from the garden, had to pretend to be very focused on her tomatoes. Clara stayed. She and Henry were a good match in the way that some people are, 2 people who fought easily and loved easily, and moved through the world at a similar velocity, which was considerably faster than George and Lillian's. Clara took to Lillian immediately, and said so with the frank directness that characterized everything about her. And Lillian, who had not had a close woman friend since Missouri, found that she had been missing this without having known clearly what she was missing. The Calloway farm became, properly, the Brenner farm, Henry's side of it, and the 2 households settled into the pleasant adjacency of family that has enough space between its parts to breathe comfortably. George built a new section of fence between the 2 properties, a real fence, properly staked and strung, with a gate in it that was usually but not always open. On the evening of the autumn that Thomas was 9 months old, with the year rounding toward its close, and the light going early again the way it had gone early the first time Lillian had noticed George standing across the property line. She was on the porch in the cooling air, and George came out and stood beside her, and they looked out across the land together in the dusk. The grass was the color of old gold, and the sky above it was the deep layered blue of the late day. And somewhere across the fence line, Henry and Clara could be heard having what appeared to be an extremely animated conversation. The words indistinct, but the tone affectionate despite its volume. Thomas was asleep inside, as he had at last agreed to be after negotiation. "Do you remember," she said, "when we used to stand at the fence line in the evenings and neither of us said why?" George looked out at the land. His shoulder was warm against hers and his hand found hers and closed around it with the same deliberateness as always, as though the choosing of it was never something he stopped doing. "I remember," he said. "What was your reason?" she asked, which was something she had never asked him directly, though she had her own answer to the version of the question about herself. He was quiet for a moment. The prairie wind moved across the grass with its long, clean sound. "The same as yours, I think," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening was settling around them, exactly the way evenings had settled around them for 2 years now, with the particular quality of the Kansas dusk that managed to be both enormous and intimate, all that sky and then the two of them beneath it. "Which was?" she said, though she was smiling. "Something on the other side of the fence," he said, "that I did not quite have a name for yet." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt him rest his cheek on her hair, and the whole of it, the garden and the farm and the child inside and the years ahead and the years already lived, gathered itself in the dusk around them with a fullness that required no addition and no amendment. The fence line was still there. The posts were straight now, and the wire taut, and the gate in it was, this evening, propped open. The line between one piece of ground and the next, between two lives that had been separate and were now one continuous thing, remained as it had always been, visible and present, and neither of them wanted to erase it, because it was the place where the story had begun, that particular borderland at dusk where two people had stood on either side of everything they had not yet said and waited, with the whole wide Kansas sky as their witness, for the right moment to say it. The stars were coming out. Thomas made a small sound through the window, not crying, only announcing himself to the evening, and Lillian smiled and George pressed his lips to her hair, and the night came in across the plains with its usual unhurried authority. And in the kitchen of the farmhouse, the lamp was lit and burning warm against the dark. And in the Calloway house, across the open gate, Henry and Clara had apparently resolved their conversation in the way they usually resolved it, with laughter. And the sound of it carried across the fence line in the autumn air, and everything was exactly as it should be. There would be more seasons. There would be hard winters and good springs and the ordinary and extraordinary business of a life built carefully and kept with intention. There would be a second child, a girl they would name Ruth, born in the summer of 1886, who would have her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of looking at the world with level and direct attention. There would be the slow growing of the cattle operation and the expansion of the kitchen garden into something that supplied not just their two households, but a modest portion of the Harlow Creek market, through an arrangement with the general store that Lillian negotiated herself with a precision that left the store owner visibly impressed. There would be the year the well ran low, and the year the cattle prices dropped, and the year Thomas fell out of the apple tree and frightened everyone extremely, before turning out to have nothing broken but his pride. There would be the letter from George's mother in Iowa saying she was old, and the answer to it that was not a letter but an arrival, an elderly woman in a good black dress who looked at her son's farm and her son's wife and her son's children, and said, quietly, that it was better than she had feared, which from Margaret Brenner was apparently high praise, and who stayed for 3 months and departed having become Clara's devoted partisan in every domestic disagreement, which George navigated with more diplomacy than Lillian had believed him capable of, until she saw it in action. There would be all of that, the long accumulation of a life that was full in the way lives become full when they are lived all the way to the edges. And at the center of all of it, through every season and every difficulty and every ordinary evening of it, there would be this: a woman and a man who had stood at a fence line at dusk for a long time without saying why, and who had found in each other the answer to the question neither of them had known they were asking, and who had built from that beginning something that was, as the years went on, very much worth standing at the edge of and looking at in the evening light. The fence was still there. It always would be, and the gate in it would always be open.